Now you see the most notorious serial killer in Canada, who evaded justice for 20 years. He didn't just kill his victims, he fed their remains to pigs. Yes, unfortunately, you heard that right. Robert William Picton was born on October 24, 1949, into a dysfunctional teenage family in British Columbia, Canada. His biological parents, Leonard and Louise Pickton, were too young and immature to raise a child, so they gave Robert up for adoption to a couple from their church, Donald and Linda Pickton, who already had 2 daughters. Robert's adoptive parents were farmers, and he was raised along with his brother David on their pig farm in Port Coquitlam, a suburb of Vancouver. Leonard Pickton was a strict and reclusive father who rarely showed attention to Robert, and when he did, it was mostly to beat or humiliate him. In contrast, Robert was extremely attached to his mother, Louise, who openly favored him over the other children. Louise Pickton was quite eccentric and untidy. By middle age, all her teeth had rotted due to a complete lack of hygiene, and she had lost her hair, replacing it with a thick beard and mustache. She constantly walked around the farm in a dirty housecoat, loose jeans, and huge rubber boots. However, Robert adored his mother and spent all his free time with her. The Pickton family lived a fairly isolated life on their farm. The farm was cluttered with junk and debris, and the house had an unbearable stench since pigs, chickens, and dogs roamed freely inside, leaving their excrement everywhere, which no one cleaned up. The Pickton children were forced to feed the pigs twice a day, always covered in manure and stench that they never washed off. This was especially true for Robert, who had a phobia of water and never took a shower. The unsanitary conditions and poverty affected the children's social lives. At school, Robert was constantly bullied for his peculiar smell and lack of hygiene. He also significantly lagged in his studies, attending only special needs classes. Eventually, at 15, Robert was expelled from school for distributing pornographic magazines. This only pleased his mother, who now had a permanent helper on the farm. Robert's brother, David, although growing up in the same conditions, managed to adapt better. He had more friends, dated girls, and even occasionally took showers. However, from the age of 16, David had trouble with the law. In 1967, he hit a 14-year-old boy, Tim Barrett, with a truck, causing serious injuries. Instead of calling an ambulance, David fled the scene. His parents, upon learning about this, decided to cover up the crime. Leonard immediately started cleaning the blood and repairing the truck, while Louise threw the injured boy's semi-conscious body into a roadside ditch where he soon drowned. Louise later confessed this episode to a friend. Despite a thriving farming and meat business, the Pictons continued to live like beggars. They constantly scavenged dumpsters for food and junk, which they brought home. Leonard always smelled of manure and even took pride in his nickname, Piggy. The most traumatic experience of Robert Picton's childhood happened when he was 12. The boy went to a livestock auction and bought a cute calf for $35, which he had earned himself to raise on the farm. For several weeks, Robert cared for and pampered his pet until one day, after coming home from school, he didn't find it in the barn. Horrified, Robert saw the calf hanging by its legs from the ceiling, slaughtered. Behind him, a quiet laugh sounded. It was Leonard Pickton, who decided to cruelly prank his son. This event deeply traumatized Robert's psyche. In his youth, Robert's responsibilities on the farm only grew. When the family moved to a new farm in Coquitlam, Robert and David fed the pigs 3 times a day, after school and on weekends. During this time, Robert found a job as a butcher's assistant and gained skills in slaughtering and butchering animals. Meanwhile, David worked in house demolition. The death of their parents in 1978 to 1979 made the Pickton brothers the official owners of the family farm and a multi-million-dollar business. Each of them, including their sister Linda, received a substantial inheritance. However, Robert's share was limited by additional conditions, possibly due to his parents understanding his instability. With the farm in their possession, the Pickton brothers somewhat expanded their activities. The farm became a junkyard for old cars and scrap metal. Robert actively developed his meat business, buying animals at auctions and slaughtering them for the locals. The farm gradually became a gathering place for various criminal elements who hung out there, unaware of the grim secrets of its owner. Overall, Robert Pickton's childhood and youth were marked by numerous psychological traumas due to the lack of parental love and upbringing, as well as the horrible living conditions. As an adult, Robert continued to live as a recluse in the poverty and unsanitary conditions he was accustomed to from childhood. Only the job as a butcher gave him some satisfaction, but later, he would channel his love for violence and blood into the most terrifying direction, specifically into a neighborhood known as East Side. East Side, or Low Track, as it is more commonly known by locals and the police, is the poorest and most destitute area not only in Vancouver or British Columbia, but in all of Canada. This urban wasteland, consisting of a dozen blocks filled with cheap hotels, pawn shops, and ruins, contrasts sharply with Vancouver's image as one of the most beautiful and prosperous cities in the world. Low Track earned its nickname, Dollar and Vein, Pain and Vanity, from its main artery, the intersection of Main and Hastings. This area has the highest concentration of drug-dependent people in the city, with official data reporting between 5,000 and 10,000 individuals. Strong psychotropic substances supplied by Latin American gangs and Asian triads are the most popular among the local residents. The majority of drug-dependent women in Low Track earn their living through prostitution and live on the streets around the clock. Their appearance is so horrifying that one reporter aptly described it as the result of a crack diet. Safe sex is unheard of here, hence Low Track has the highest HIV infection rate in North America. According to a 1995 survey, 73% of East Side women started prostituting themselves as children. The same percentage were unmarried mothers with an average of 3 children, 90% of whom were lost to social services intervention. Less than half knew where their children were. Notably, over 80% of Low Track sex workers were born outside of Vancouver and ended up here in search of a better life. The history of East Side is a chronicle of endless human tragedies. Initially, the neighborhood was flooded with homeless and unemployed people who flocked to Vancouver hoping to get rich at Expo 86. Around the same time, cartels flooded the area with cheap drugs, breaking the lives of an entire generation. Religious communities, in an attempt to beautify their streets, drove sex workers into this very cesspool. The final blow to Low Track was dealt in the 1990s. Federal welfare cuts in 1994 left many without means of subsistence, and psychiatric hospitals dumped their patients onto the streets. By 1997, rampant promiscuity and drug addiction caused an HIV epidemic, infecting 1 in 4 residents of the neighborhood. Government needle exchange programs, distributing up to 3 million units annually, failed to stop the epidemic. By the way, what do you know about this neighborhood? In 1998, an average of 1 person died daily from an overdose in East Side. But it turned out that drugs weren't the only threat to the destitute here. A few years before Expo 86, the first disappearance of a woman from Low Track occurred, which the police ignored. It wasn't until 14 years later, when the number of missing women numbered in the dozens, that attention was finally paid. Prostitutes are a very elusive category of victims. Usually, they are runaway girls who constantly change names and addresses, hiding from everyone. So when they disappear, it's hard to determine if it was voluntary or forced. Investigators had little chance of tracking the fate of individual women. However, over time, a sinister pattern emerged in the disappearances of Low Track prostitutes. One of the first to disappear was Rebecca Guno on June 22, 1983. But most victims were reported missing only months or even years later. For instance, Teresa Williams, who disappeared in July 1988, was reported missing in March 1989. Kathleen Watley, last seen in June 1992, was searched for only at the end of the month. During this time, the perpetrator only intensified his activities, shortening the intervals between abductions. From August 1997 to October 1998, 6 more women disappeared. It was during this period that Robert William Picton, a 48-year-old failed farmer from Port Coquitlam, appeared on the police radar. Almost all the missing women were seen in the company of this reclusive man who constantly roamed East Hastings in search of cheap women and drugs. Picton was well known in local brothels and drug dens and readily bought services and goods without bargaining. According to eyewitnesses, Picton lured prostitutes with promises of drugs, money, and shelter on his farm. Many fell for his tales of a better life away from Low Track. Getting into Picton's smelly van, the poor souls had no idea they were heading to their own funerals. Since 1980, Picton regularly visited a waste processing plant where he disposed of animal remains from his farm. This place was located a block from East Hastings, making it easy for the farmer to combine his legitimate business with his gruesome hunting of women. According to a police task force report from 1998, in just the last 3 months, Picton had taken at least 4 women from East Side. Another 4 women had dropped off his radar because they either died of overdoses or escaped from the terrifying death factory. However, the police discovered the existing victims too late. Thus, thanks to a fatal combination of circumstances, the authorities' indifference, the imperfections of the laws, and the murderer's cynicism, East Side became Picton's ideal hunting ground for many years. Low Track supplied the maniac with new victims, and he turned them into missing persons and fed their remains to his pigs. It wasn't until the persistence of certain detectives and the relatives of the deceased forced the police to at least start investigating the series of mysterious disappearances that had swept the scariest neighborhood in Vancouver. In the mid-1990s, brothers Robert and Dave Picton began hosting loud parties on their pig farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. These large gatherings, known as Piggy Palace, attracted hundreds of people and became a popular entertainment venue not only for local criminals but also for ordinary residents and even off-duty police officers. The Piggy Palace was officially registered as an entertainment business. It had security, bartenders, live music, and a spacious dance floor. On successful nights, the Picton brothers earned between $10,000 and $40,000 Canadian dollars per party. These profits, along with their meat and pig farming business, allowed Robert and Dave to significantly increase their wealth. Robert Picton, with years of experience as a butcher and meat cutter, was responsible for slaughtering livestock on the farm. He bought animals, often sick and covered in ulcers, at low prices at auctions. The animals were then slaughtered and hung by their legs. Afterward, Robert butchered the carcasses, and the meat was sold to customers or stored in refrigerated rooms. Animal remains unsuitable for human consumption were taken by Robert to a waste disposal plant in Vancouver. This facility was located a few blocks from East Side, the poorest and most crime-ridden area of the city, known for its brothels, drug dens, and high concentration of homeless people. Starting in 1995, the number of missing persons in this area skyrocketed. Although the victims' acquaintances repeatedly reported to the police, the authorities did not show much concern for the fate of marginalized women. Meanwhile, Robert, like his brother Dave, led an active social life. He frequently visited local bars and met women, some of whom even lived with him in a trailer on the farm. During one such cohabitation with a woman named Tanya Carr between 1992 and 1995, Robert temporarily suspended his criminal activities. But this lull did not last long. Once Tanya left, he resumed hunting for victims. One time in 1995, Robert brought a woman named Tracy, a sex worker from East Side, to the farm. In his trailer, filled with women's clothes and jewelry, Robert tried to force Tracy to look for his wallet and then threatened her with a knife. Eventually, he let the frightened woman go, driving her back to the city. On the way, Robert boasted that he was a white knight who saved bad women and gave them a second chance. At the same time, he threatened to kill those he couldn't fix. Tracy was lucky to survive this terrifying encounter. However, other victims of Robert Picton were not so fortunate. In 1995, near the farm, an unidentified woman's skull was found, sawed in half and showing signs of long-term storage in a freezer. An autopsy revealed that the skull was cut with the skills of a professional butcher. Despite this, Robert Picton remained out of suspicion for a long time, and his criminal activities gained momentum. The killer's brutality increased, the number of victims grew, but the police did not take decisive action. Parties at Piggy Palace continued to bring the Pictons huge profits, which no one paid attention to. The lack of oversight from the authorities allowed the farm to become a den of debauchery and crime. Even explicit hints of Robert's involvement in the disappearances of homeless women, voiced by his former lover Lisa Wells, did not prompt immediate police action. Only in the early 2000s, when the number of missing women from East Side reached dozens, did the police finally begin a thorough investigation. By that time, Robert Picton had become one of the most terrifying serial killers in Canadian history. In the early 1990s, Vancouver police began receiving increasing reports of women going missing in the East Side area. Most of these women were involved in the sex industry and led marginalized lives, complicating the investigation of their disappearances. Often, relatives and friends of the missing did not immediately report to the police, and when they did, they encountered a skeptical attitude from the authorities. The police did not see a connection between the numerous disappearances for a long time and did not give them proper attention. Such women often moved from place to place, changed names, and disappeared for a while, so their disappearances were not seen as something extraordinary. Police inaction allowed the criminal to continue his activities with impunity. It wasn't until 1998 that an official search for the missing women began in Vancouver. This happened after concerned citizens handed the police a list of over 30 women who had disappeared without a trace on the streets of East Side in previous years. However, even then, the police were reluctant to take on the case. The initial check of the list revealed nothing suspicious. Some of the missing were found alive in other cities. Others died of diseases or overdoses. It seemed there was no cause for concern. The case only moved forward thanks to Detective Dave Dixon, who decided to dig deeper. He personally reviewed all the missing prostitute reports and compiled a new list of 16 women. All of them were last seen in the East Side area, starting from 1995. Such a number of disappearances in a relatively short period could not be a simple coincidence. Dixon managed to create a special task force to investigate these cases. Despite the obvious similarity of the disappearances, even within the task force, not everyone was convinced there was a connection between them. Some police officers believed the women might have voluntarily left the city in search of a better life. Theories were proposed about their possible departure to other cities or even countries. There was a lack of facts that unequivocally pointed to criminal activity. The situation began to change when news of the investigation leaked to the press, causing a public outcry. Journalists began their own investigations, interviewing acquaintances and relatives of the missing, drawing public attention to the issue. Under pressure from the media and public activists, the police had to step up their efforts, especially after human remains were found on the outskirts of the city in the fall of 1998. This forced investigators to consider the possibility of a serial killer operating in Vancouver. A large-scale investigation began. All possible leads were checked, and potential suspects were followed. The Vancouver police received assistance from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The number of missing women cases investigated by the task force reached 31. An unprecedented search operation was launched. However, the investigation's success was limited. The investigation lacked experience in such cases, as Canada had not previously faced crimes of this scale. There were no bodies, crime scenes, or physical evidence for a long time. Only fragmented testimonies from acquaintances of the missing women, which often contradicted each other. The lack of information generated numerous rumors and speculations, which only hindered the investigation. Some progress occurred at the end of 1998 when task force detectives received information from Bill Hiscox, a man who had worked on Robert Picton's pig farm. Hiscox reported that strange things were happening on the farm. Prostitutes were often brought there, suspicious people constantly roamed around, and most importantly, women he had seen with Picton later disappeared without a trace. Hiscox claimed he saw items belonging to the missing women on the farm and was convinced Picton was involved in their disappearances. This information forced the task force to focus on Robert Picton. It turned out he had a history of violent incidents. In 1997, Picton was accused of attacking a woman he nearly stabbed on his farm, but the case was mysteriously dropped. Other women also complained about Picton's violent behavior, his passion for sadism, and his strange sexual habits. All this made him highly suspicious. However, there was still insufficient evidence to arrest Picton. Detectives put Picton and his farm under covert surveillance, hoping to capture something incriminating. But Picton, if he was the killer, was very cautious. He seemed to sense he was being watched and gave away nothing. Moreover, some influential people among his acquaintances stood up for Picton, so detectives were advised not to rush to conclusions. The investigation hit a dead end. Meanwhile, the disappearances continued. In 1999 to 2001, another 20 women went missing from the ill-fated East Side, and all this happened against the backdrop of loud parties that Picton continued to hold on his farm, ignoring the authorities' interest in him. The police admitted their efforts were still in vain. They could only hope that if a serial killer existed, he would eventually make a mistake that would lead the investigation to him. But years passed, the number of victims grew, and the long-awaited mistake did not happen. It was only in early 2002, after more than 4 years of unsuccessful investigation, that an event finally occurred that gave the police a chance to expose the criminal and end his atrocities. This event was a search of Robert Picton's farm, which revealed the horrifying truth hidden behind the walls of Piggy Palace. The findings in Picton's possession shocked even seasoned police officers. On February 6, 2002, the police finally dared to search Robert Picton's property. The formal pretext was Picton's possession of unregistered weapons, but in reality, the investigators hoped to find evidence linking him to the disappearances of women from East Side. On that day, dozens of law enforcement officers flooded the farm in Port Coquitlam, owned by Robert and his brother David. Robert Picton and his brother were arrested for illegal possession of firearms, allowing the police to obtain a warrant for further searches of the premises. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. All over the farm, which more resembled a junkyard, were scattered personal belongings of the missing women, their clothes, jewelry, and documents. And in Picton's refrigerators, human remains were found, later identified as parts of his victims' bodies. The most horrifying sight was the barn Picton used for slaughtering and butchering bodies. Dried blood and human hair were found on the meat hooks, and under the floor, teeth and bone fragments were discovered. Along the walls stood barrels filled with a foul-smelling liquid containing decomposing human remains, which Picton used to feed his pigs. It was a gruesome scene. One of the officers involved in the search later recounted, "The stench of decay was so unbearable you could hardly breathe. It felt like we were in hell on earth. I had seen dismembered bodies before, but what we found at Picton's was beyond description. It was like being in a horror movie." The farm was literally filled with evidence of horrific crimes. In piles of trash, criminologists found sawed bones, teeth, and strands of hair. In the freezers were limbs wrapped in plastic bags, and buried in the backyard, barrels were full of partially decomposed remains. To examine all these gruesome finds, a whole army of experts worked on Picton's farm. For months, they sifted through tons of soil and debris, searching for the smallest fragments of evidence. Overall, the search lasted almost 2 years. During this time, remains of 48 women were found on the 6.8-hectare property, although only 27 could be definitively identified. During the searches, it was revealed that Picton liked to photograph and videotape his victims in various stages of dismemberment. Hundreds of horrifying photos and recordings were found on the farm. Some showed Picton posing next to severed heads or mutilated bodies. He seemed to take pride in his horrific deeds and kept these trophies as mementos. Witness testimonies gathered during the investigation complemented the picture of Picton's atrocities. For example, sex worker Lynn Ellingson, who attended his parties, said she saw a woman hanging on a meat hook in the barn with her skin peeled off. Another witness, Bill Hiscox, who worked for Picton, confessed he had often seen him lure women from East Side to his trailer, only for them to disappear without a trace. During interrogations, Robert Picton mostly remained silent or proclaimed his innocence. But in one video recording played in court, he confessed to a friend that he killed prostitutes and fed their remains to pigs. "The best way to get rid of a body is to give it to pigs. They eat it quickly, along with the bones and everything else," Picton's voice was heard on the tape. As it turned out, Picton lured his victims to the farm with promises of drugs and money for sex. There, he drugged the women and then attacked them. Some he strangled to death, others he killed with a sledgehammer or hammer. Afterward, he dismembered the bodies in the barn using a chainsaw and knives. The remains were thrown into acid barrels or used as pig feed. Some body parts he scattered throughout Vancouver, discarding them in dumpsters or landfills. The more details of the investigation came to light, the greater the shock to Canadian society. People could not believe that a maniacal killer could operate for so long in a civilized country, destroying dozens of homeless women. Many blamed the police for negligence and bias, as the disappearances of East Side prostitutes had been known since the 1980s, but the authorities ignored the problem for years. It was only when the number of Picton's victims reached staggering proportions that the police finally recognized the serial nature of the crimes and launched a large-scale investigation. But even after the first searches of Picton's farm, several months passed before he was finally arrested for the murders. In the meantime, he likely managed to destroy many pieces of evidence. On February 22, 22, Robert Picton finally ended up behind bars. He was charged with the murder of 27 women, whose names were identified from the remains found on his farm. But the real number of victims of this monster, according to law enforcement estimates, could reach 49 or more. At the time of his arrest, Picton had a reputation as a quiet and friendly farmer who sometimes sold meat. None of his neighbors had any idea about the horrifying secret of Piggy Palace. The trial of Robert Picton, which began in 2007, became one of the most high-profile and extensive in Canadian history. He was charged with 27 counts of first-degree murder committed between 1995 and 2001. Most of his victims were prostitutes, drug addicts, or homeless women from the troubled East Side neighborhood. On the defendant's bench, Picton behaved calmly and showed no remorse. The jury took 10 months to review all the evidence and hear 128 witnesses in the case. In their verdict, they found Picton guilty of the second-degree murder of 6 women, whose remains were found on his property. The court decided not to consider the remaining 20 cases, fearing the trial would be prolonged. On December 11, 2007, the judge sentenced Robert Picton to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Mr. Picton sowed death on an unprecedented scale. He disregarded human life and exploited vulnerable women to satisfy his perverted desires. Neither remorse nor humanity stopped him, the judge said during the verdict. For the relatives of the deceased women, this sentence was a moral victory but did not bring relief. Many of them never received official recognition of the death of their loved ones, whose remains could not be identified. Others accused the Canadian justice system of leniency, as Picton effectively received the minimum punishment for his atrocities. The case of Robert Picton left more questions than answers. Why did the police ignore the disappearances of homeless women for so long? Did the killer act alone, or did he have accomplices? How many victims actually died at his hands? Unfortunately, we may never know the whole truth. Picton never repented and remained silent until the end of his days. The investigation into the disappearances of women in Vancouver's east side was accompanied by numerous shortcomings that significantly complicated the search for the criminal and the arrest of serial killer Robert Picton. One of the main reasons was the Vancouver police's rejection of the new method of geographic profiling developed by Inspector Kim Rossmo. Kim Rossmo, the creator of the geographic profiling method, noted the unusual concentration of disappearances in East Side as early as May 1999. His method involved mapping unsolved crimes and identifying patterns or signatures of criminals that might be overlooked by detectives assigned to individual cases. However, the Vancouver police dismissed his insights and rejected the possibility that the missing women could be victims of a serial killer. Instead, the police claimed that the women might have voluntarily left Vancouver in search of better living conditions. Refusal to work according to Rossmo's method led to his demotion, and he was forced to resign. He was simply told, "You don't understand anything, and your methods are childish." This internal conflict only worsened the situation. The police were left without concrete evidence of a crime for a long time due to the absence of bodies or crime scenes, significantly complicating the collection of forensic evidence. Furthermore, Canada's violent crime tracking system did not monitor missing persons without specific evidence of a crime, further complicating the search. Problems also lay in the reluctance of pimps and sex workers to cooperate with the police due to fear of possible arrests. Resources were limited despite growing media attention to the case. Several suspects, such as Michael Leopold and Barry Thomas Niedermeyer, were considered, but none were found guilty of the women's disappearances. Evidence was insufficient, and the police focused on a few suspects, leading to wasted time and resources. A key moment in the investigation came when Bill Hiscox, who worked on the Picton brothers' pig farm, reported that women visiting the farm disappeared without a trace. Despite his testimony and suspicions, the police did not pay due attention for a long time. It wasn't until 2002, when the police issued a warrant to search the Picton's farm for suspected illegal firearms, that evidence linking Picton to the missing women was found. The impact of rejecting the new profiling method and investigation shortcomings led to many tragedies. The Vancouver police spent years searching for the criminal, during which dozens more women went missing. Delays and insufficient resources allowed Picton to continue his crimes. The refusal to work with Rossmo's methodology, which could have helped find patterns in the disappearances faster, led to lost lives and immense suffering for the victims' families. The shortcomings of the investigation and rejection of new methods underscore the importance of effective coordination and use of modern technologies in criminal investigations. Refusal to cooperate with profilers and insufficient resources can have catastrophic consequences, as happened in the Robert Picton case. This story should serve as an important lesson for law enforcement worldwide. Innovations and new investigation methods can save lives and protect innocent people from horrific suffering. I would like to address the law enforcement agencies. You failed, and the blood of those women is still on your hands because you could have acted more effectively, and you'll have to live with that. This is my personal opinion because, believe me, I've described only 10% of the atrocities I know about because YouTube simply wouldn't have allowed me to publish it otherwise. What is your opinion? Write in the comments. The crimes of Picton, revealed thanks to the diligent work of investigative profilers, left a deep mark on society. They highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized groups such as East Side women and the need for greater protection and support for them. The moral of this story lies in the need for effective, prompt, and unbiased investigation, regardless of the victim's social status. Thank you for watching. You are the best. Take care of yourself. I love you.